My roommate's freeloading girlfriend cornered me in my own kitchen to police my clothes and lied to my face that the guys were kicking me out, until I caught her red-handed. She was standing in my kitchen in a bathrobe she had not paid for, in an apartment she did not live in, eating food she had not bought, and she was looking at me like I was the problem. That was the moment. That was the exact moment I should have understood what I was dealing with. But I was 24 and conflict-averse in the way that people who grew up in quiet households are conflict-averse, and instead of saying what needed to be said, I smiled and made my coffee and retreated to my room like I was the guest. I paid $1,300 a month to retreat to my room. This is the story of the 4 months it took me to stop retreating. Of the lies I uncovered, the manipulation I did not see coming, and the specific, clarifying moment when I caught her in the middle of the thing she had been doing to me and watched her face do the calculation of someone who has just run out of road. I am not a dramatic person. I do not enjoy conflict. I want you to hold on to those two facts as I tell you what happened, because by the end of this story I was shaking in a hallway and I need you to understand that it took a genuinely extraordinary amount of provocation to get me there. The apartment was a 3-bedroom in a mid-sized city, the kind of place that is never quite clean and never quite dirty, with a kitchen that fits 2 people comfortably and a living room couch that had been there since before any of us moved in. I had lived there for a year before the situation started. My roommates were Marco and Dev, 2 guys I had found through a mutual friend, and the arrangement had been, for that first year, genuinely good. We kept different schedules. We respected each other's space. We had an unspoken but functional system for shared expenses and cleaning and the ordinary negotiations of people living in close proximity. Marco had been dating Sasha for about 8 months when she started appearing at the apartment with a frequency that should have triggered a lease conversation but somehow never did. It crept. That is the thing about the crept, you do not notice it happening in real time. 1 weekend a week became 2, became a stretch from Thursday to Monday became, by the time I started counting, 5 or 6 nights out of 7. She did not live there. Her name was not on the lease. She did not contribute to rent or utilities or groceries. She did not participate in the cleaning system. She was, by any reasonable accounting, a guest who had long since exceeded the definition of guest and become something else, something that did not have a polite name. But she was Marco's girlfriend and Marco was my roommate and the apartment was working in every other respect and I told myself it was fine, the way you tell yourself things are fine when the cost of them not being fine seems higher than the cost of absorbing them. I absorbed for 2 months before the kitchen incident. I should tell you about Sasha before I tell you about the kitchen, because understanding what happened requires understanding who she was in the architecture of that apartment. Sasha was 27 and between jobs for the entirety of the time I knew her, though the between was doing a lot of work in that description because the jobs she was between seemed to be separated by increasingly long intervals. She was not lazy in the obvious sense. She was industrious about certain things, her appearance, her social media, the specific project of making herself comfortable in spaces that were not technically hers. She had moved into our apartment in increments the way that certain plants take over a garden, a toiletry here, a drawer claimed there, a spot on the couch that became her spot, a shelf in the fridge that became her shelf. She and I had not had a real conflict in those first 2 months. We were cordial in the way of people who are not natural allies but who have a mutual interest in the peace. She was pleasant on the surface and I was pleasant on the surface and underneath the surface I was watching the food I bought disappear faster than I was eating it and wondering if I was imagining it. I was not imagining it. But the food was not the kitchen incident. The kitchen incident was something else. It was a Saturday morning in early spring. I had the day off and I had slept late and I came out of my room in the clothes I sleep in, which were a pair of shorts and an oversized t-shirt, and I went to the kitchen to make coffee. Standard Saturday. Nothing remarkable. Sasha was already in the kitchen. In the bathrobe. At the counter. She looked at me when I came in and her eyes went to my shorts and then back up to my face with an expression I can only describe as assessment. I said good morning and went to the coffee maker. She said, "Hey, can I talk to you about something?" And I said sure, the way you say sure when you do not yet know what you are agreeing to. She said, and I want to be accurate here because the precise words matter, I just think, when the guys are home, it would be more respectful if you wore a little more. Like, they're trying not to make it weird but it's hard for them when you're walking around like that. I stood at the coffee maker and processed what had just been said to me. I was in my own kitchen. In shorts that came to mid-thigh. In an oversized t-shirt. On a Saturday morning. In the apartment I paid $1,300 a month to live in. And the woman who did not live there, who did not pay for anything in the space she was occupying, who was wearing Marco's bathrobe and had eaten my yogurt 3 days earlier, was telling me to cover up. I want to be honest about my response because it is not the response I wish I had given. I said okay. Not okay as in agreement. I did not agree and I did not feel okay. But I said okay because I was conflict averse and it was Saturday morning and I had not had coffee yet and the part of my brain that processes confrontation had not fully come online and she had deployed the information with such casual confidence that it landed before I could examine it. She went back to whatever she was doing. I made my coffee. I went to my room. I sat on my bed and drank my coffee and felt, slowly, the full weight of what had just happened settle onto me. She had told me that the guys were uncomfortable with how I dressed in my own home. Marco and Dev. My roommates. The people I had lived with for over a year. Who had never said a single word to me about my clothing. Who I had walked past in shorts and t-shirts hundreds of times without a single moment of visible discomfort or complaint. The guys were trying not to make it weird. The more I sat with it, the less it sounded like something the guys had said and the more it sounded like something Sasha had decided and attributed to the guys so that it would land with the weight of consensus rather than the weight of one person's opinion about how I should dress in my own home. But I did not know that yet. I only suspected it. And suspicion without evidence is just anxiety with a narrative. I went to get more coffee and put on longer pants. I want to stay with what that felt like for a moment because I think it is important and because I have talked to enough people since to know that this specific experience, of being made to feel like a problem in your own space, is more common than it should be and less talked about than it deserves. I was not wearing anything provocative. I was wearing what I slept in, what I had worn in that apartment for over a year, what any person might reasonably wear in their own home on a Saturday morning. And I had been told, by someone with no authority to tell me anything, that my body in those clothes was a problem that the men I lived with were heroically tolerating. I changed my clothes. And then I spent the next several days moving through the shared spaces of my own apartment with a self-consciousness that had not been there before, second-guessing what I was wearing before I left my room, feeling like a guest in a place I paid for. This is what that kind of thing does. It does not matter whether the claim was true. The mere introduction of the idea, planted with enough confidence by someone who seemed to have insider knowledge, was enough to change my behavior. I was modified without a shred of evidence that modification was necessary. I was furious about this, quietly, in the way I was furious about most things in those days, internally, without outlet, building pressure I did not know how to release. I tried, once, to approach it with Dev. Dev and I had always had the more natural conversational relationship of my two roommates. He was straightforward in a way I found easy to navigate, the kind of person who says what he means and means what he says. I caught him in the kitchen a few days after the bathrobe conversation and I asked, as casually as I could manage, if he had ever felt uncomfortable with how I dressed around the apartment. He looked at me with genuine confusion. What? He said. Like, has it ever been weird? Me being around in, like, casual stuff? He stared at me for a moment. No. Why would it be weird? No reason, I said. Just checking. He shrugged and went back to what he was doing and I stood there with the coffee mug in my hand and felt the specific, cold clarity of a suspicion being confirmed. Dev had not said anything to Sasha about my clothes. I would have bet my security deposit on it in that moment. Which meant Marco had not either, or if he had said something that Sasha had amplified and redirected into a conversation that served her own purpose, which I was beginning to understand was the establishment of territory. She was marking what was hers. And what was hers, in her accounting, apparently included the right to determine how I existed in shared spaces. I was done being modified. The 2 weeks after the Dev conversation were a study in changed behavior. Mine, not hers. I stopped preemptively making myself smaller. I wore what I had always worn. I did not go out of my way to provoke. I was not going to walk around in a bikini to make a point, but I was not going to put on jeans on a Saturday morning in my own apartment because someone who did not live there had decided my pajamas were a problem. Sasha noticed. I could tell she noticed by the way her eyes tracked me when I came into the kitchen or the living room, that same assessing look from the bathrobe morning, waiting to see whether the modification had taken. It had not taken. She did not bring it up again directly. Instead, something else started happening, something subtler and, I would come to understand, more calculated. Things I said in passing started coming back to me slightly wrong, reported to Marco or Dev in forms that were accurate in their content but altered in their tone. I would mention being tired from a late night out and it would come back as me complaining about the noise level in the apartment. I would say I was having a stressful week at work and it would surface as me being difficult to live with lately. Small distortions. Nothing you could point to cleanly and say this is a lie. Just the constant, low-grade sensation of your words being picked up and set back down in slightly different shapes. The lie I did not see coming arrived on a Tuesday evening in month 3. I had come home from work to find Sasha alone in the apartment, which happened sometimes and which I had stopped letting bother me. She was on the couch with her laptop and she looked up when I came in with the expression of someone who has been waiting. Hey, she said. I'm glad you're home. I wanted to talk to you before the guys got back. I put my bag down. Okay. She did a thing with her face, a performance of reluctance, of being the bearer of news she wished she did not have to bear, that I recognize now as the particular expression of someone who has rehearsed the next thing they are going to say. I don't really know how to say this, she said, because I actually like you and I think you're a good person. But I've been hearing some stuff from Marco and Dev and I think you deserve to know. I sat down on the chair across from her. What stuff? They've been talking about asking you to find a new place, she said. At the end of the lease. They haven't said anything to you yet because nobody wants to have that conversation, but I've been hearing it come up and I just thought, if it were me, I'd want to know so I had time to figure things out. She said it with the soft, careful delivery of someone performing reluctant honesty. She said it with concern written across her face and her voice pitched to just the right level of apologetic. I felt the floor move. I want to describe what that information did to me in the moment it landed, before I had any reason to question it, because the impact of it was real even though the information was not. I thought about the past year. The apartment that had been working. The roommates I had believed I was in a functional, decent arrangement with. I thought about whether I had been missing signals, whether there had been friction I had misread as normal, whether the person I thought I was in that space was not the person they experienced me as. I did a rapid, anxious audit of my entire tenure in that apartment looking for the evidence that would make Sasha's information make sense. I found things that could be made to fit. That is the insidious thing about that kind of information delivered with that kind of confidence. Your brain will find the evidence to support it if you look hard enough, because your brain is trying to make sense of something that feels like it must have a cause. Did they say why? I said. She made the reluctant face again. Just that things have felt tense lately. That you seem unhappy here. That it might be better for everyone. I nodded. I thanked her. I went to my room. I sat in my room and I thought about looking for a new apartment and I thought about having to tell my parents I needed to move and I thought about the cost of first and last and deposits on a new place and I thought about what I had done to make my roommates want me gone. I did not sleep well that night. I want to tell you how I found out it was a lie because the how matters. 2 days after the couch conversation, I was in the kitchen making dinner when Dev came home. We had the easy small talk of people who have lived together long enough to be comfortable, and somewhere in the middle of it, because I could not hold it anymore, I said, "Hey, I want to ask you something directly and I need you to be honest with me." He turned from the fridge and looked at me. "Are you and Marco thinking about asking me to leave when the lease is up?" The look on his face answered the question before his mouth did. It was not guilt or discomfort or the face of a person caught in something. It was genuine bewilderment, the kind you cannot perform, the kind that comes from hearing something that has no relationship to your actual reality. "What?" he said. "No. Where did you hear that?" "Sasha told me you and Marco had been talking about it." The bewilderment shifted into something else. Something I could not read immediately but that I would understand better in the hour that followed. "Marco," he called down the hall. Marco appeared. Dev repeated what I had said. Marco's face did the same thing Dev's had done, the bewilderment, then the shift. "She said that?" Marco said. "Those words," I said. "That you'd both been talking about asking me to find a new place at the end of the lease." Marco and Dev looked at each other in the way of two people exchanging something wordless, something with history in it. "That's not a conversation that has ever happened," Marco said. "Not once." The three of us stood in the kitchen for a moment in the specific silence of people who have just confirmed something none of them are happy about. "Where's Sasha?" I said. "She was in Marco's room. Marco went to get her." I stood in the kitchen with Dev, who looked tired in a way that suggested this was not entirely a surprise to him, and we did not say much because there was not much to say yet. When Sasha came out, she was composed in the way of someone who has had 30 seconds to prepare and has used them well. She looked at me with an expression that was preloaded with a counter-narrative. I could see it there, ready to be deployed. "Sasha," I said, and I kept my voice as even as I could, "did you tell me that Marco and Dev had been talking about asking me to leave?" "I told you what I heard," she said. Careful. Not a denial, not yet. A hedge. "What exactly did you hear?" "I just said that things had seemed tense and that I thought it might come up." "That's not what you said. You said they had been talking about it. That nobody wanted to have the conversation. Those were your words." She looked at Marco. The look was not asking for backup. It was more like a check, a rapid calculation of what he had told me and what she could still work with. "I might have said it stronger than I meant to," she said. "Did Marco or Dev ever say anything to you about wanting me to leave?" A pause. Shorter than it should have been for someone telling the truth. "Not in those words." "In what words?" Another pause. She did not answer. Marco, quietly, said her name. And that was the moment. Not an explosion. Not a confrontation of the kind I had played out in my head. Just her name said quietly by the person she had been doing this through, and the road running out, and her face doing the calculation of someone who has no move left. The thing about being caught in a lie is that there are two kinds of people who get caught. The first kind gets caught and the shock of exposure produces something genuine, shame, remorse, the visible recognition of having done something wrong. The face collapses inward. The defenses drop. There is a moment of real nakedness before whatever comes next. The second kind gets caught and immediately begins the project of reframing the catch. The lie did not happen. The lie was a misunderstanding. The lie was actually a version of the truth that you are too unsophisticated to interpret correctly. The exposure is not the end of the story but the beginning of a new story in which the person caught is actually a victim of the catching. Sasha was the second kind. I watched it happen in real time, in my kitchen, with Marco and Dev standing there and the silence sitting in the middle of us. She moved through the reframe quickly and with the fluency of someone for whom this was not unfamiliar territory. I was trying to give you a heads up, she said. I could tell things were tense and I thought you deserved to know how it was feeling. I'm sorry if it came out wrong. There it was. Not, I made something up. Not, I told you something false. I'm sorry if it came out wrong. The apology aimed not at the lie but at my reception of it, the suggestion that what had happened was a communication failure rather than a deliberate fabrication. I looked at Marco. Marco was looking at Sasha with an expression I could not fully decode from the outside but that contained, I thought, the particular fatigue of someone encountering a familiar pattern. I said, it didn't come out wrong. You told me specifically that they had been talking about it. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a thing you said. I was trying to help you, she said. And here is where I did the thing I am most proud of in this entire story, I did not argue with that. Because arguing with that was exactly what she wanted, the pivot from what she had done to whether her intentions were good, and I was not going to follow her there. Marco, I said, Dev. I want you to know that I heard that and I spent 2 days thinking about finding a new apartment. That's what that conversation did. Marco closed his eyes briefly. Dev said nothing but his jaw tightened. I'm going to go to my room, I said. I think you three should talk. I went to my room. I closed the door. I sat on my bed and I was shaking, not from anger exactly but from the physical aftermath of having held myself together for a conversation I had needed to hold together for. They talked for a long time. I heard the low-registered sounds of it through the wall but not the words. At some point I heard a door. Marco knocked on my door about an hour later. He sat on the edge of my desk chair and he looked, to his credit, like a man who was taking what he needed to take from this. Not defensive. Not minimizing. Tired in the way of someone who has had a hard conversation and knows the hard conversation was necessary. He said he was sorry. Not a qualified sorry, not a sorry if you felt. A direct, clear sorry for what Sasha had said and for the fact that it had happened in his apartment through his relationship, and that he had not seen it coming. I asked him if anything like this had happened before. He was quiet for a moment. Nothing I could point to, he said. But there have been things that felt off. Things I couldn't nail down. I understood that. The not nailing down is part of how it works. The things that feel off but exist just below the threshold of something you can confront directly are not accidents. They are calibrated to stay there, below the threshold, creating discomfort and uncertainty without ever becoming the kind of clear, nameable thing that would require a direct response. Is she still here? I said. She went home, he said. I nodded. He left. I made tea. I sat with a full accounting of what had happened and tried to figure out what I was going to do with it. What I did, in the immediate aftermath, was talk to Dev. Dev had been quieter than Marco during the kitchen confrontation and I had read that as his processing style, the way some people go inward when things get complicated. I found him in the kitchen the next morning and we talked for a long time, longer than Dev and I had probably ever talked about anything real, and what came out of that conversation recontextualized several months of low-grade unease. He had noticed things. The food disappearing faster than it should, which he had been attributing to Marco and had apparently been half wrong about. The way conversations he had with me or Marco seemed to arrive back later in slightly altered forms. A thing she had said to him once, early on, about how I had complained to her about the noise he made coming in late, which I had not done and which he had believed but which had created a small, unnecessary distance between us that I had felt but not been able to explain. That one hit me harder than I expected. Dev and I had been friendly and easy for a year, and then sometime in the past few months there had been a slight pulling back in him that I had attributed to natural variance in roommate dynamics and that turned out to have been planted. She had been doing it to both of us. Not dramatically. Not with the kind of obvious interference that would be visible and nameable. Just small seeds, dropped into separate conversations, designed to create the faint, persistent sense in each of us that the others were less on our side than we thought. It is an effective strategy when you need to secure your position in a space you do not have a legitimate claim to. If the roommates are slightly uncertain about each other, slightly convinced that the others have grievances they have not expressed, they are less likely to form the coalition that might examine your presence clearly. I am not saying she had worked all of this out strategically in advance. I do not know what goes on inside someone else's head. What I know is the effect, which was deliberate feeling in its precision even if the deliberateness was partly intuitive. The next 2 weeks were uncomfortable in the specific way of a space where something has been exposed but not yet resolved. Sasha still came to the apartment. Less than before, at least initially, but she still came. She and I were thoroughly polite to each other in the way of people who have had a confrontation witnessed by others and who are both performing normalcy for the audience. I watched Marco navigate it. I want to be fair to him here because I think he was genuinely trying to do the right thing and genuinely struggling with the fact that doing the right thing had a cost he had not expected to pay. He had been with Sasha for nearly a year by then. Whatever had been between them was real enough to have survived a lot, and he was not going to simply eject her because of one bad conversation, even a bad conversation I had evidence for. I understood this. I did not like it, but I understood it. What I did not understand, and what became increasingly difficult to absorb, was that the behavior did not stop. It modulated. It became more careful. But the low-grade interference continued in forms that were harder to pin down now that I was watching for them. A comment here. A reframing there. The ongoing project of making me feel like a guest in my own space, now conducted with more subtlety than before. The thing that finally broke the equilibrium happened about 3 weeks after the kitchen confrontation. I had been grocery shopping and come home to find Sasha in the kitchen alone, cooking what appeared to be a full meal from groceries that were not hers. I stood in the doorway with my bags and looked at the pan on the stove and the ingredients on the counter and did the arithmetic. The chicken in the pan was from a package I had bought 3 days ago and had been planning to cook that evening. I knew this because I had moved the package to the front of the fridge that morning specifically so I would not forget it. I put my bags down. "Is that my chicken?" I said. She turned from the stove with an expression that was already preloaded, already reaching for an explanation. "Marco said it was okay," she said. "Marco said it was okay to use my chicken?" "He said the fridge was communal." I want to tell you that I handled this exchange with perfect composure. I did not. I am not going to pretend I did. I told her, with a directness I had not used with her before, that the fridge was not communal, that we had always maintained separate shelves, that she was aware of this because she had her own shelf, and that Marco did not have the authority to grant access to food he had not bought. She said I was being hostile. I said I was being clear. She left the kitchen. The chicken stayed in the pan. I finished cooking it because at that point the damage was done and throwing it out would have been waste without principle. But something had shifted in me during that exchange, something that had been building since the bathrobe morning and the closed comment and the fake eviction news and the 3 weeks of watching her recalibrate rather than stop. Something had shifted from absorbing to deciding. I was done deciding this was a situation I had to manage. I was going to change the situation. I sat down with Marco that evening and I told him directly that I needed things to change or I was going to start looking for a new place. Not as a threat. As an honest statement of where I had arrived. I told him that I had been in this apartment for over a year before Sasha started spending time here, that I had managed 1 year of good cohabitation with him and Dev, and that the past 4 months had been a different experience entirely and that the difference was a variable I could name. He listened. He did not interrupt. He had the face of someone sitting with something difficult. I told him about the chicken. I told him about the ongoing sense of being surveilled and managed in my own space. I told him about Dev's revelation regarding the late-night noise that Sasha had apparently invented. I laid it out clearly and without drama and I gave him the choice of what to do with it. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. He said, "I hear you. And I believe you. I want you to know that." I said, "I know you have to make your own decisions about your relationship. I'm not asking you to do anything specific. I'm telling you what my line is." He said he needed some time to think. I said okay and I meant it. What happened in the following week, I only know partly from direct observation and partly from what Marco told me later, which he told me more than I expected and with a candor that I respected. He had a long conversation with Sasha. Multiple conversations. He told her specifically what I had told him and, I think, also things that Dev had said separately. He asked her direct questions and listened to the answers and compared the answers to what he knew. I do not know exactly what she said in those conversations. What I know is the outcome, which was that by the end of that week she had stopped coming to the apartment with the frequency she had been coming. And then, within another 2 weeks, she had stopped coming at all. Marco did not make an announcement about it. He just told me one evening, without much ceremony, that he and Sasha had ended things and that she would not be around anymore and that he was sorry it had taken as long as it did to see what was happening. I told him I was sorry it had ended that way. He shrugged with the particular resignation of someone who has processed a loss and is not going to perform more grief than he actually feels. She wasn't who I thought she was, he said. That's on me for not seeing it sooner. I did not agree with that last part. I think she had been careful about what she let him see. But I did not say so. The apartment returned to something after that. Not immediately and not completely, because things that have been in a certain configuration for months do not simply reset the moment the configuration changes. But gradually, over weeks, the texture of the shared space changed back towards something that felt like what it had been in that first year. Dev and I talked more. The slight pulling back that had been planted between us dissolved when there was nothing left to maintain it. Marco went through the quiet, private process of coming out the other side of something, and I gave him the space to do that without turning it into a bigger conversation than it needed to be. The food on my shelf stayed on my shelf. I wore shorts on Saturday mornings. I came out of my room without calculating whether my presence was welcome. These sound like small things. They were not small things. They were the ordinary freedoms of living in your own home, and I had been subtly, incrementally stripped of them by a person who had no lease and no right, and no claim to anything in that space beyond what Marco's affection gave her access to. I had taken those freedoms back. Imperfectly and later than I should have and with more absorbed discomfort than any of it deserved. But I had taken them back. I moved out 6 months later, not because of any renewed conflict but because my lease was ending and I had been offered a position in another city and the timing aligned. I moved out on good terms with both Marco and Dev, which is the ending to the roommate chapter that I had been hoping for before any of this happened and that I am glad survived it. Marco and I got a drink the week before I left. We talked for a few hours and the conversation was easy in the way that conversations with people you have been through something real with can be easy, the ease of shared knowledge that does not need to be performed or processed out loud. He said, at some point, that he still thought about the things he had not caught while they were happening. The small distortions. The things that felt off but never crossed the threshold into something nameable. The way a person can be in your life for nearly a year and you can know them less than you think you do. I told him I thought that was less about him failing to pay attention and more about how that kind of thing is specifically designed not to be caught. That the whole mechanism of it depends on staying just below the threshold. That he had believed her because he had no specific reason not to and because the specific reasons accumulated over time in a way that only became visible in retrospect. He seemed to find some use in that. I hope he did. I think about the kitchen a lot. The bathrobe morning. The way she stood there with the casual, ownership-adjacent confidence of someone who had never paid $1 toward the space she was occupying and told me to cover up because the guys were uncomfortable. I think about the 2 days I spent in anxious, self-auditing misery after she told me I was being asked to leave. The way a lie delivered with enough confidence and enough claimed insider knowledge can completely override your own experience of your own life. The way I changed my behavior based on information that was entirely fabricated by someone whose interest was in making me feel like less of a fixture in my own apartment. I changed my clothes. I lost sleep. I mentally drafted emails to parents about needing to move. I did all of that because someone who did not live there and who paid for nothing decided I was in her way and found the most efficient route to making me doubt myself. The most efficient route was to use the voices of the people I trusted. Marco's name. Dev's name. Claimed conversations that had never happened. The authority of consensus that was never real. That is the thing I want to name clearly, for anyone who is in a similar situation and trying to figure out if they are imagining it. You are not imagining it if the information you are receiving does not match your direct experience of the people it is supposedly coming from. You are not imagining it if the person telling you what others are saying has something to gain from you doubting yourself. You are not imagining it if the most effective response to the information is to ask the people directly. Ask the people directly. Dev's face in the kitchen when I asked him told me everything before he opened his mouth. That face cannot be faked. That genuine confusion, that complete absence of recognition, is information. I should have asked sooner. I know that. But I was conflict-averse and I had been socialized to absorb before I confronted, and the situation had been designed to exploit exactly that tendency. I am in a different city now, in a one-bedroom I do not share with anyone, and I am here to tell you that the specific, quiet pleasure of knowing that everything in your space is yours and that no one is going to stand in your kitchen in someone else's bathrobe and tell you to cover up is not something I will ever take for granted again. My threshold for absorbing things that feel wrong has been permanently recalibrated. Not because I am looking for conflict. I am still not a person who enjoys conflict. But because I now understand the cost of staying below the threshold indefinitely. The slow erosion of ordinary freedom. The way you can be incrementally moved out of your own life by someone who is patient enough to do it in small steps. The bathrobe. The close comment. The fake eviction. The food. The planted distances between me and the people I actually lived with. None of it was dramatic. That is the point. None of it was the kind of thing that produces a clear moment of confrontation. It was the accumulation of small, deniable things, each individually absorbable, collectively a project. A project aimed at making me smaller in my own space. She could be larger in a space she had no legitimate claim to. She miscalculated one thing. She assumed that a person who absorbs keeps absorbing. Some people absorb until they catch you in a kitchen, asking you direct questions in front of the people whose voices you borrowed, and watch you run out of road. That is what happened. And when she ran out of road, I was standing there in my own kitchen, in my own apartment, and for the first time in 4 months the kitchen felt completely, unambiguously mine. It took too long to feel that way. It will not take that long again.